In the last section, we spoke about the three separate pieces of setting up Ingress inside of Kubernetes. So we've got the Ingress config, we've got the thing that actually implements that configuration, and then we've got the thing that actually takes incoming traffic and sends it off to the appropriate service. So I now want to take this type of approach right here and apply it to the actual application that we are looking at. Now, there is going to be one little twist here. Remember that I had told you just a little bit ago that the setup of all this Ingress stuff changes a little bit depending upon your environment. So we're going to look at a diagram here that describes how all this stuff is set up specifically on Google Cloud. So the actual implementation when we set this up locally is going to be just a little bit different, but the Google Cloud implementation is probably the easiest to understand and kind of wrap your head around. So here's what's going to happen. Again, you and I are going to make an Ingress config file, and that's going to describe all the routing rules that should exist inside of our application. This config is going to be fed into a deployment that is running both our controller, the Ingress controller, and an Nginx pod. And that Nginx pod is what's going to actually take incoming traffic and route it off to the appropriate location. Now, specifically on Google Cloud, there's some other pieces in here that get created at the same time as well. So when we make an Ingress on Google Cloud, we're going to get a Google Cloud load balancer created for us. This is a cloud-native load balancer, identical to the one that you would use with any other type of application that you might happen to create on Google Cloud. In fact, you can open up a new tab right now and search Google Cloud Load Balancer, and you'll see some marketing page here for Google Cloud Load Balancing. So this is the actual object behind the scenes that's going to be created by Google Cloud to somehow get traffic into our cluster. Once that load balancer is in effect, inside the cluster itself, the deployment that gets created is going to get a load balancer service attached to it. Yes, the same load balancer service that we had discussed a little bit ago. So even though we had spoken about this thing and we had said, oh yeah, the load balancer service is kind of a little bit legacy and we don't really use it anymore and we prefer to use Ingress, well, behind the scenes on Google Cloud, the load balancer service is still being used. And you wouldn't quite know it unless you actually looked at some of the source code or config files that set all this stuff up. So incoming traffic will come to the Google Cloud load balancer. That load balancer is going to send that traffic to a load balancer service inside the cluster, which is going to eventually get that traffic into the Nginx pod that gets created by our Ingress controller. It's then up to that Nginx pod to eventually send that traffic off to the appropriate service inside of our application, either the multi-client or the multi-server. Now there's one last little piece of the puzzle here that I just want you to be aware of. By default, when you set up all this Nginx Ingress stuff, there's going to be another deployment set up inside of your cluster, something called a default backend. The default backend is used for a series of health checks to essentially make sure that your cluster is working the way that it should be working. Now, we're going to be making use of the default backend inside this course, but ideally, like in an ideal world, you would actually replace the default backend pod right here with your Express API server. And so anytime that the Nginx pod needs to check the health status of our application, it would be ideal to tell it to reach out to the multi-server as opposed to the default backend. And I'll show you very quickly how you could do that later on. But for right now, I just want you to be aware that there is going to be this additional deployment inside of our application. Okay, so that's it. That's what's happening behind the scenes. Now, one last quick thing here, something that you might be a little bit curious about. So at this point, we've said, oh yeah, we're actually using this load balancer service, and the load balancer service is getting traffic eventually into an Nginx pod. So why, oh why, would we not just do this stuff manually to a degree? Why are we going to go through all this extra setup of this Ingress stuff and the Ingress config and a whole bunch of additional setup on top of that when we could take a much more straightforward and simplistic approach? Something like this right here. Why do we not just set up our own load balancer service manually that points to our own custom copy of Nginx? We've already made use of Nginx quite a bit throughout this course, so why do you and I not just make our own kind of custom Nginx server that sends traffic off to the appropriate set of pods? Well, the reason that we are still going to make use of Ingress Nginx as opposed to setting this stuff up manually is that when you make use of the Nginx Ingress project, it actually has a bunch of code added into it that is very much aware of the fact that it is operating inside of a Kubernetes cluster. So as one little example, there's many examples of this, but I'm going to give you one very quick example. When you make use of the Nginx Ingress project, rather than taking incoming traffic and sending it off to the cluster IP and allowing the cluster IP to load balance that request off to some random pod inside of here, the Nginx Ingress project is not actually going to send traffic over to the cluster IP service and allow that to do some amount of load balancing. Instead, the cluster IP service does still exist, and it still is working to essentially keep track of all these different pods. But anytime we get an incoming request to the Nginx pod right here, the Nginx pod is going to actually route the request directly to one of these different pods, completely bypassing that cluster IP service. The reason that this is done is to allow for features like, say, sticky sessions, which is a reference to the fact that we sometimes want to make sure that if one user sends 2 requests to our application, we want to make sure that both those requests go to the exact same server. And there's some cases where that feature is extremely handy and actually 100% necessary to have. So that's just one example of why we are making use of this Ingress Nginx project, as opposed to kind of doing our own build-it-yourself solution. So you certainly can do a build-it-yourself solution. It's just going to lose out on a couple of these extra features that you get for free when you make use of the Ingress Nginx project. Okay, so enough on all this. I think we've had enough discussion around the theory, and all that's really left is going through the setup process. So let's take a quick pause right here. In the next section, we're going to start setting up Ingress Nginx inside of our project.